Campaigns of the Age of Darkness. The Siege of Cthonia. Years of darkness and blood. It is said that the annals of war are inscribed only by those who have tasted victory, and in that it may transpire that the truth will die with us here today. Fight now not for triumph or glory, but with your heart filled with spite and vengeance, and die comforted in the knowledge that no chronicle of our darkest hour will be made. Unattributed Vox Intercept from the Fall of Dranam. The Fallen Empire. In the years that followed Horus's treachery, the Imperium had been dragged down from the precipice of a golden age and plunged into cataclysm. The Warmaster's betrayal had allowed the bitter seeds of rebellion and corruption sown over the span of 2 centuries during the Great Crusade to take root, and from them gnarled and warped boughs had grown to shade the galaxy in darkness. Where once sanity and order had prevailed, desperation and chaos now reigned. All that had once been held dear, now nothing more than fuel for the mechanisms of war. Those who had pledged their allegiance to Horus had shed any veneer of nobility and revealed themselves as unashamed, debauched, and possessed of twisted ambition. What was not reduced to ruin and ash under the feet of the grandest armies that had ever existed became the prey of the denizens of the Imperium, beckoned forth through ruptures in reality itself by acolytes of the profane and the corrupt. Even as the vast legions of Horus bore down on the Sol System to claim the prize of Terra itself, a war like no other raged out amongst the stars. Deeds that would otherwise pass into the annals as legend would transpire without being recorded in so much as a cursory note. Mighty heroes fell, only to be buried under the bodies of the nameless dead. All those who would remember them now slain, and memory of them lost to a war that consumed all. Such was the magnitude of the final bitter years of the Horus heresy. Battles were fought not for strategic gain or for tactical advantage, but rather to indulge murderous intent. The blood of billions was spilled simply to facilitate the deaths of billions more. In the wake of war, worlds were left as charnel houses, the bones of once thriving bastions of the Imperium mouldering upon blackened and tainted earth. Here, when it seemed the flickering light of humanity itself would be extinguished, nothing of what once had been had value now. The Great Crusade had been for naught, and in the end there was only death. Despite this, those that remained loyal to the Imperium fought on in the darkness and in grief against those that had turned against them. Without hope of victory and the pretense of honor lost, they fought not for glory or conquest as it once was, but they fought, pushed to the bounds of sanity, for vengeance. Driven to survive only so that they could fight again, they stood shoulder to shoulder, forever changed, shadows of who they once were, and swore a new oath. An oath to fight on forever, for now they knew there could only be war. Years of darkness and blood, the final years of the Horus heresy. War in the shadows. The events that took place in the proximity of the Segmentum Solar during Horus's march on Terra would become some of the most storied and significant battles the Imperium had ever known, overshadowing any throughout the entire history of mankind. Rogul Dawn, the Primarch of the 7th Legion and Praetorian of Terra, had set his defences against the inevitable coming of the traitor hordes, and the Emperor himself waged a hidden war of his own within the webway, the space that existed between reality and the immaterium. Loyalist forces were drawn in to man defences that ranged from the cordon wall of the Imperial Palace itself to the distant cold moons of Pluto. Traitor forces left ruin in their wake as they massed and prepared to assault the most heavily defended position in the galaxy, the Sol System. The cradle of humanity was, however, not the only place that battles still raged during the latter years of the heresy. The remnants of expeditionary fleets, garrison forces, and warbands that were still dispersed throughout the furthest reaches of the galaxy did not all voyage to converge upon Terra. Many heeded that call, but were contained behind entrenched blockades and possessed numbers too few to break out and join the fight by the side of the Emperor. Traitor forces of Emperor's children, Death Guard, Iron Warriors, World Eaters, and Thousand Sons amassed in the Inward Cluster, effectively holding loyalist Imperial Fists captive upon their own home world. What resources were occupied in keeping the 7th Legion from reinforcing Terra were deemed worthwhile if they reduced the number of guns arrayed the top of the ramparts of the Imperial Palace by even a handful. Elsewhere, upon the distant worlds of Truthen, contingents of the Iron Hands and Iron Warriors had maintained their alliance and were oblivious to the events of the heresy. In 010 Millennium 31, the peace was shattered with the arrival of both Raven Guard and Alpha Legion warships in open conflict. Legionary war rapidly engulfed the planet as the horror of betrayal was revealed anew. The entirety of Druthen's capital city and billions of its inhabitants were lost in the space of a short few hours. The immense structure toppled from its gravitational harness and sent crashing into the planet's surface. Some were embroiled in wars of their own making, campaigns to exterminate those who they once had called cousins, or wars of attrition fueled by bitter hatred. The overarching strategic objectives of many of these conflicts were insignificant in comparison to the opportunity they represented to exact a toll in blood from those who had become the sworn enemy. Little thought was given to the spirit of noble conquest and expansion that prevailed during the era of the Great Crusade, and instead, utter destruction of the foe and any hold they inhabited became the only measure of victory. The Foricon Campaign. A loyalist fleet composed of reconstituted fragments of Salamanders and Iron Hands battle companies arrived in the Foricon system in 013 Millennium 31. Having abandoned any hopes of breaking the blockades that surrounded Terra, and with them they brought war. The Foricon system had been held by a garrison force of the 4th Legion since the latter days of the Great Crusade, although Perturabo's Legion had not been drawn there to simply subjugate its populace, or to establish a fortified base of operations in a strategic position in the Segmentum. Instead, they had come to safeguard the extraction of the planet's vast reserves of promethium from beneath the sands of its massive land masses. At the end of the Great Crusade, and during the Horus Heresy, the production of Foricon III's sprawling refineries had been distributed throughout the Traitor Legion, and its contribution to the campaign on Terra was recognized by the Warmaster himself. Initially, in the years soon after Horus turned on the Imperium, the planet was a bustling waypoint for his battle fleets, and the size of the garrison force grew exponentially. With the planet's orbital docking plates extended to accommodate this activity and fortified with substantial defensive batteries. Nomadic tribes moved across the barren continents, living in rapidly erected hab-domes, connected by walkways and gantries that were raised high above the desert sands on stilts. Major settlements in the localities of the refineries were populated by the workforces that existed in thrall to the Iron Warriors. Here some billions of souls subsisted, packed into rusting frontieris pattern hab units, stacked on top of each other in grids that extended kilometers beyond sight. Generations had lived and died knowing little more than toil in the sweltering promethium rigs. The fervent activity within the system was short-lived, as traitor forces were marshaled towards the Sol System, and instead plundered the resources they needed from conquered worlds along their route, leaving Thoricon III to fade into irrelevance. Although no formal order had ever been issued to the Iron Warriors to abandon their position within the Thoricon system, the shift of focus led some of the more impetuous commanders amongst their ranks to take leave with their respective companies to join the front lines of the war. This left a section of only the most stoic and resolute 4th Legion commanders who resolved to maintain dominance over the system, if only to deprive Loyalist forces of its remaining resources. Identifying an opportunity to strike at the traitor stronghold on Thoricon III, while its strength was diminished and much of its manpower had been directed towards the Sol System, and to make use of its resources, the Loyalist fleet immediately went on the attack. A spearhead fleet ran a gauntlet directly through the fire arcs of the orbital defenses around the planet, much of the fleet operating on automation protocols due to the lack of crews available to operate them. After punching through the inner cordon of the defensive network, combined salamanders and Iron Hand strike forces were able to make planetfall and establish a beachhead on the expansive barren plains of Thoricon III's northeastern quadrant. Initially, they encountered little resistance, as they grouped into mechanized formations and dispersed from their primary landing sites in a methodical sector-by-sector sweep. The first actions of the traitor forces on the surface were indicated by heat signatures blooming on the ranged auger sweeps of Loyalist forces that peered beyond the horizon. The pipe stills of thousands of promethium refineries had been set ablaze at the command of the Iron Warriors, with fuel enough to burn for decades. Thick clouds of oily soot rose high into the atmosphere, then rained back down as a greasy sludge when it condensed. With this destructive action, Perturabo's legion intended to create a polluted hellscape through which the Loyalist forces must cross in order to join in battle. No matter the direction of the Loyalist forces' advance, they were met with a determined resistance from the Iron Warriors, whose time on Thoricon III was spent honing battle strategies, perfecting their defenses, and remaining ever vigilant, despite their apparent redundancy in the wider war. This, however, was perfectly matched by the vengeful rage that burned in the hearts of both the Iron Tenth and the Sons of Vulcan. Both legions, shattered and broken at Istvan V, had consolidated their fury and resolved to bring death to their sworn enemies at any cost. Armored spearheads clashed as they engaged across 100-kilometer-wide fronts in the expansive desert plains, leaving the blackened, burnt hulls of thousands of armored vehicles littering the dunes. Vicious fighting enveloped the dense worker settlements, the junctions of narrow alleyways between the hub blocks becoming murder traps as squads of snipers and marksmen picked off any individuals brave or foolish enough to attempt to cross the open ground. In the tumult of Horus's defeat, the fate of the Thoricon system was forgotten, and of whichever force claimed victory there, it seemed that so few survived that no significant records exist. No banners of allegiance to either faction were planted in that earth, and by the time the last refinery stack had burned out, all that remained were the charred wrecks of countless war machines and the ruined bodies of thousands of warriors, left to be consumed by the shifting sands. The caches of Vesdale. Across the breadth of the galaxy, legions carved paths of destruction through space, their commanders unbeholden to any higher authority and unrestrained in their fury. At Vesdale Secundus, the Primarch Leman Russ and his 6th Legion had no knowledge of the planet's secrets prior to their assault, and so had not come to liberate the bountiful caches of weapons stored there. Instead, it was an action compelled by rage and fury, and a longing to destroy their traitorous brethren. Little was known of the value of the Armorium world outside of those of the 20th Legion. Indeed, it is posited in contemporary times that the concentration of supplies and equipment, such as it was a component of one of the many complex subterfuges devised by Alfarius himself. Fittingly, the planet itself had not possessed overt orbital defenses that would have marked it out as an objective of military value, and instead it lay some distant from frequented routes, inconspicuous and innocuous, amongst a galaxy racked by disruption and unrest. As the Space Wolves fleet amassed within the system, the Alpha Legion and their allied secular and janissary cohorts made no effort to resist or confront them, an act that enraged Leman Russ, who perceived it as a failure to acknowledge his authority and standing. A direct address from the Primarch himself was relayed by the Vox Hailers of every vessel under his command, a challenge for the highest ranked of the Alpha Legion host to face him. But no response was made, and only silence was the reply. Defiant, the Alpha Legion host that held Vedzel under its protectorate, supported by a large cohort of the Solar Auxilia, left Russ's hail unanswered, and instead opened fire on the ships of his fleet as they assumed an orbital strike formation. Across the entirety of Vedzel Secundus, the 6th Legion were overcome with a bestial fury as they attacked all who stood before them. The price in blood was paid mainly of the Securan Janissaries, their numbers counting for little against the vicious assault of Russ and his legion. Ever elusive, the Alpha Legion contingent refused to meet their assailants in a pitched battle, instead opting to strike and fade, forcing the Space Wolves to expend their energy hacking through the vast number of the auxiliary soldiery. None were offered mercy or the option to surrender, and none sought that outcome. Records of the battles that raged through the expansive storage facilities of Vedzel, including picked feed captures from the helmets of 6th Legion warriors, accounted for an alarmingly low number of confirmed kills of 20th Legion enemies, a curious fact that was corroborated by the presence of very few dead and wounded in the aftermath of major actions. Even more alarming was what was revealed in the vaults below the surface of Vedzel's vast storage yards, many of which were obliterated during the battles that took place. When Vedzel finally fell to the Space Wolves, and when 6th Legion tech marines managed to decrypt the ciphers that secured the great blast doors to the subterranean stores, they discovered endless rows upon rows of Legion battle plate of numerous designs, some recognized as standardized patterns along with many esoteric, unrecognized markings bearing the heraldry and iconography of each legion. Coal-black armor dating back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade, adorned with winged swords, were arrayed in their thousands, while sleek Mark VI suits of crimson decorated with lustrous gold filigree around each eye lens were stored in their hundreds. Elsewhere, segmented suits with great hemispherical pauldrons of ivory white bearing crescent moon icons were stored in complete sets, along with suits lacquered in hues that matched those of no known legion and bearing symbols of unrecognized provenance and meaning. The end of hope. These battles and countless more typified the Horus heresy during the latter years of the conflict. The pall of vengeance, spite, and hatred spilled across the galaxy like an oil slick, as once proud crusading legions indulged their base instincts and became desperate killers, fixated on ending their foe and erasing any evidence of their existence. Despite the overarching goals of Horus, those that had joined in his rebellion were now fractured by infighting, chasing individual objectives to satisfy their own desires, and building petty empires in the shadows of destruction. Whilst the traitors had achieved much since the Warmaster had raised his banners in defiance of their emperor, much had been lost along the way. With all eyes set upon the traitors' march on the Sol System, a splinter fleet of Horus's own legion broke away, drawn to reclaim their home world of Cthonia from the clutches of the Imperial Fist garrison that had remained there for close to a decade. Unlike the attack on Terra, the locus of Horus's mad war on the Imperium, the Siege of Cthonia saw the 16th seek to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs, their homeworld and the honor of their legion. Once more it was the resumption of old grudges and the prosecution of private wars, bloodshed that fulfilled no strategic goal, an eternity of war that threatened to continue forever. Pride's bitter reward. The Siege of Cthonia. Preface. This is the truth of the Imperium. This is the tale of the Age of Darkness, when Horus turned upon the Emperor and forever shattered the Imperium. A time of betrayal and heroism that has shaped our own pale age in its bloody image, condemning us to a grim future that holds only war. In the grasp of that cruel age, brother was pitted against brother, the Emperor's legions, warring with each other until the toll of the dead exceeded the count of the living. Worlds beyond number were ruined, their people slaughtered to feed the ambition of Horus, and the Imperium left a hollow wreck of its former splendor. Yet, to the bitter glory of that age, do we look with envy. For though it was a time of tragedy and hardship beyond measure, those who walked that bloody road did so at the side of gods. Now, none yet living witnessed that age. It has passed fully into legend, and even in the great libraries of Terra and Ophelia, we have but fragments of its truth. To those who lived in the shadow of its tragedy, it must have seemed that the Imperium would never recover from such reckless hate. Yet the cycle of history ever turns onwards, its misery and glory repeated in equal measure. Now, in these dire times, the tale of mankind's rise and fall is as vital to us as it was in those dark years. Or know the bitter end to which the tale must come, and yet, in its telling, find the strength once wielded by the heroes of ages past. This is the truth of the Imperium. This is a tale of the Horus heresy. Wars are won by those wise enough to put aside vainglory and pride. But legends are forged only by those courageous enough to embrace adversity. Attributed to Leman Russ, master of the Space Wolves. In the Eye of the Storm. The final cataclysmic years of the Horus heresy are replete with desperate last stands and brutal slaughters. Death and destruction were to be found everywhere. For all across the Imperium, the pretext of a war fought for any objective other than hate had fallen away. Now armies sought only to slake their hunger for vengeance and blood, ignorant of victory or any hope for the future, but obsessed only with the need to drag down old foes and end once and for all the old feuds. Amidst all of this madness, the Siege of Cthonia stands as the epitome of needless sacrifice, forgotten heroism, and stubborn hatred. Here on the broken world that had moulded the Warmaster and his legion, that had been ignored for almost 70 years of bitter strife, would be played out all the hatreds of the Horus heresy's last years. Even as the Warmaster's hordes in Sol broke the Eternity Gate and breached the Emperor's palace, the Imperial Fists on Cthonia fought to the last. And even as Horus succumbed to the dark lure of power in the skies above Terra, the Sons of Horus on Cthonia sought to erase the dishonor of losing their home world. In the years to follow, these acts of futile courage would be forgotten, overshadowed by the last apocalyptic battle on Terra, and those for whom these little wars would be counted their final epitaph are now little more than footnotes in history to be argued over by scholars of the obscure. For all the irony of its forging, there is much to be lauded in the annals of this conflict, much that can be learned of the nature of the Horus heresy and the warriors that prosecuted that most infamous of wars. To truly understand the events of the Siege of Cthonia and its importance to the wider conflict that was the Horus heresy, it must first be placed in its appropriate time and context. This was not a single isolated battle, but the inevitable conclusion of a chain of events set into motion long before its bloody finale. Much as with the wider Horus heresy, The final throes of war on Cthonia were the culmination of decades of grudges, rivalries, and misfortunes. Yet during those dark years, the grim links of grievance and sorrow were often overlooked. The surviving records of the Dark Age lay bare the path that leads to this tale's inevitable end. The trail of regrets and failed dreams that brings us to one of the last and most iconic of the Horus Heresy's forgotten battles. This is the story of the Siege of Cthonia. The Fall of Terra. Most accounts of the final years of the Horus Heresy fail to mention the Siege of Cthonia for one reason: the Fall of Terra. This one battle, Horus's last desperate gambit and final confrontation with his father and creator, overshadows almost all other events, no matter the importance we may ascribe to them. As such, we shall briefly revisit this most epic of battles, so that it may be put to one side for the remainder of this treatise and be properly addressed in a tome of its own. Sol itself would be the target of traitor raids and spoiling attacks as early as 010 Millennium 31. Though these minor incursions were swiftly repulsed by the defenders, it would not be until 013 Millennium 31 that a full-scale invasion of the Sol System would be prosecuted by the traitor host. An attack on such a scale that Dawn and his beleaguered forces could only delay its advance on Terra. This assault would be ongoing at the same time as the Sons of Horus began their attack on Cthonia, with Horus's landing on Terra itself occurring alongside his legion's final attack on the Imperial Fists' defences. Though some have questioned the timing of the event, it is widely accepted that the final actions of the Siege of Cthonia occurred at the same moment as the Emperor bested his traitorous son, Horus, in personal combat. However, any link between these two events remains purely speculative, given the distance separating the Cthonis and solar systems. Carta Galactica. Circumspectus. Cthonia. 001 000 Millennium 31. Cthonia was a world of hard rock, worm-bored with tunnels and underground cities, orbiting a slowly dying angry blue star in an otherwise lifeless system. Colonized in the lost past, Cthonia was a world of riches that had been systematically gutted over thousands of years, leaving only a hollowed-out carcass. Mankind had burrowed even deeper into Chthonia's crust and stabbed its surface with processing hives, which eventually collapsed and crumbled into the endless caverns that existed below its barren and poisonous surface. These lightless realms of mining boar and fallen hive world serve as the refuge and prison of the brutal race of mankind that survived the Age of Strife on Cthonia. Relatively close to Terra in the Void, and with whom some minor intermittent contact had been maintained even through the Age of Strife, Cthonia was one of the first worlds to be brought into the fold of the new Imperium. As Cthonia had at that time no form of organized governance, this was undertaken without the consent of its population, which was largely left undisturbed underground, while the fledgling Imperium sought to reap what meagre remnants of Chthonia's mineral wealth remained. Indeed, the expedition of the 5th Legion that first surveyed Cthonia urged the eradication of the brutal native society, deeming it a nest of serpents coiling in the dark that would be better to be destroyed. However, the Imperium needed fangs, and saw in the depths of Cthonia a new source of wealth in the savage skills of its people. The extent of Chthonia's underworld and its unseen hordes would prove a greater treasure than the Imperium had foreseen, for not only did they prove excellent stock for both the Imperial Army and Legiones Astartes, but they also harboured one of the lost Primarchs. At the direction of Horus Lupercal, newly titled Master of the 16th Legion, the people of Cthonia would serve both as warriors in the Imperial armies and also as labourers in the newly restored factories. Indeed, the greatest of these reborn highs would be renamed Lupercal's Gate, and serve as a bridge between the lightless underworld that trained the brutal warriors of Cthonia and the surface world where outworlders struggled to restore the barest glimmer of Chthonia's former glory. Addendum. After the outbreak of the Horus heresy, Dawn would order the subjugation of Cthonia and the suppression of its indigenous people, seeing it as a stronghold of traitors on the doorstep of terror. The same garrison Horus had left to watch over his home world was scattered, its survivors disappearing into the trackless depths of Cthonia to continue their resistance, while the Imperial Fists contented themselves with occupying the surface and orbital infrastructure. The hive of Lupercal's Gate was renamed Traitors' Gate, and the monuments once raised to honour the Warmaster of the Imperium were toppled and smashed. All work to restore the shattered world of Cthonia stopped, and the Imperial occupiers turned their efforts to extracting whatever resources they could to feed the increasingly desperate war effort in Sol and beyond. Part 1. Shadows of the Future. Those who speak of victory before the foe lies dead are fools. Only once the final blow has been struck does the struggle end. Attributed to Angron, the Red Angel, Master of the World Eaters. 642006, Millennium 31. Cthonia would see not one siege during the Horus heresy, but two. The first, a bloody precursor to the second, a grim mirror of the fate that waited for Cthonia in the final years of the Horus heresy. This first siege, while brief and far less cataclysmic than the latter, serves to set the stage for what would become one of the more iconic of the Horus heresy's final battles. In the wake of the infamous drop site massacre, where the gathered might of several of the loyalist legions were sundered by betrayal, Rogel Dawn enacted plans to fortify the Segmentum Solar and the Sol System. With much of his legion still scattered in the aftermath of that battle, Dawn could defend only a few key worlds, seeking to stop the traitors' advance long enough to rally the other legions. Paramar, Beta Garman, and Lauren Alpha would become the front lines of the civil war, fortress worlds to hold the traitors' advance in check. Horus could not bypass these loyalist strongholds and leave them at his back as he pressed towards Terra and the inevitable confrontation with the Emperor, and would be forced to give battle on ground of Dawn's choosing at last. Cthonia was the dagger at Terra's back, a world replete in warriors, arms and munitions, loyal to the now traitor Warmaster, and close enough to the Sol System that an attack force could arrive long before reinforcements could be diverted from the fortress worlds of the Segmentum Solar. Such a threat could not be ignored, and even as Dawn rushed to halt Horus's advance, he also directed what troops he could spare to neutralize the threat of Cthonia and turn that danger to his advantage. For that world, which left unchallenged, would grow to become a traitor stronghold in the heart of the Solar Segmentum, could become an armory for Dawn's legion in the coming years, a prime source of both weapons of war and warriors to wield them. The first siege. To this end, Dawn delivered the 9th and 14th Battalions of the Imperial Fists and Space Wolf's 13th Great Company, several Terran cohorts of the Imperial Army, and even 3 sodalities of the Legio Custodes to Cthonia. In command of the battle group was Lord Castellan Evander Garius, a warrior who had once served alongside the Lunar Wolves during the glory days of the Great Crusade, a veteran now out of favour with his master, Rogel Dawn. For this mission he was the perfect tool, for he understood his foe like few others could, and was desperately eager to regain Dawn's approval. Only 2 chapters of the Sons of Horus were stationed in defence of Cthonia, both having recently arrived on-world to replace combat losses with fresh recruits, as well as a reinforced company of word-bearers. These limited forces could not hope to stand against the wrath of the Imperium, a fact that cannot have escaped the noted military genius of the traitor Warmaster, and which implies that Horus had no intention of fighting to retain control of his adopted homeworld. Horus had wagered everything on a grand attack on Terra from his new stronghold in the far galactic north. To him, it appears that Cthonia was a strategic bluff, a means to draw off some of Dawn's strength, and nothing more. Perhaps it was foreknowledge of this strategy, or simply pragmatism in the face of overwhelming force, that afflicted the traitor forces on Cthonia in 006 Millennium 31, for they made little attempt to stand against the invasion fleet in open battle. Their starships abandoned the system in the face of the Imperial fleet that translated into the Cthonia system, while the warriors of the traitor legions now stranded on Cthonia chose not to contest the Loyalist landings. Instead, they retreated to the high spire of Lupercal's Gate and the Terminal Atlas, seemingly intent to mount a defense against the invasion from these more fortified holdouts. Deployed by drop assault, the fleet warriors of the Space Wolves' 13th Great Company led the Imperial assault, and on the grey plains before the towering spire of Lupercal's Gate, the first blood was spilled. The wolves offered no quarry and swept across those isolated units they encountered, unleashing every weapon at their disposal and allowing the foe no chance to rally or counterattack. Of those Sons of Horus units that faced the warriors of Fenris that day, none survived, and few of the remains that were left behind could be identified, most hacked apart or blasted beyond easy recognition. In their battles with the Thousand Sons, which had taken place barely a year earlier, the Things of the 13th Great Company had learned to hold nothing back when making war against the Legiones Astartes. As the wolves of Fenris anointed the soil of Cthonia with the blood of its former lords, the Imperial Fists pressed the attack on the vast spire of Lupercal's Gate. With the Imperial army detailed to encircle the immense structure, a phalanx of 7 Leviathan siege dreadnoughts smashed apart the primary gateway, shattering the golden eye of Horus adorning it. Though the contingent of Sons of Horus defending the gate fought tenaciously, they could do little more than delay the hulking dreadnoughts. One of the mighty war engines brought low by a barrage of melter blasts, and another by point-blank fire from a Vindicator siege tank. The brutal tactics of the Great Crusade met the stubborn valor of the Legiones Astartes. Where once such bold strikes had overwhelmed lesser foes, they proved less efficacious against the Emperor's turncoat Space Marines. Yet the Sons of Horus, for all their defiance, could not hold against the numbers of the foe, and the Imperial Fists pressed home their attack, leaving only sea-green corpses in their wake. On the heels of the warriors that had cleared the gatehouse came a cadre of Huskars and Varagir, gold and grey, led by Evander Garius of the 456th Company. These elite warriors sought to take swift control of the sky vault atop the highest spire, where rested the Black Throne of Cthonia, the very seat from which the traitor Warmaster had once ruled over the world that had raised him. In his eagerness to seize this great trophy for his own Primarch, Garius committed the best of his warriors to the assault on the Sky Vault, where a few dozen Sons of Horus and inducted automata stymied his advance in a series of cunningly planned battles. The Sons of Horus, outmatched by the elite of 2 legions, used the high city itself as a weapon in what they must have known was a futile struggle. Power junctures were rigged to detonate, bulkhead doors sealed shut, and in one case an entire subsection of Upper Pylon 19 was detached from the high superstructure by means of a series of explosive bolts to carry a squad of Huskars to a fiery death. For nearly 4 hours, the Sons of Horus kept Lord Castellan Garius at bay, heedless of their own losses and the damage wrought to the hive's upper levels. the defence collapsing only when Garius and Thane Colby of the Vargir stormed the sky vault and struck down the Sons of Horus chieftains. Far below in the depths of Lupercal's Gate, where the Imperial Fists had expected to meet similarly dogged resistance from the proud Sons of Horus, they would find only scattered bands of defenders. It quickly became apparent to the Loyalist field commanders that the traitors had no intention of defending the vast high city, but instead intended to sabotage key systems to render it useless to the attackers. A hollow prize to set before the feet of their emperor. Left with little choice, the Imperial Fists committed themselves to securing a few key facilities, knowing that they could not entirely thwart the wiles of their enemy. Cadres of shield-bearing breachers overwhelmed the Sons of Horus saboteurs that were attempting to overload the ancient reactors of Lupercal's Gate, but could not stop the Sons of Horus from destroying the Hive's augury arrays and macro-cannon defense batteries. Harried by Imperial Fist Rangers and the Stalkers of the Space Wars, the vast majority of the Sons of Horus garrison retreated through the vast subgate in the very roots of Lupercal's Gate and disappeared into the uncharted depths of Chthonia's underworld, where, while isolated, they continued to present a threat to the occupying Loyalist forces. A bitter trophy. Despite such minor setbacks, Cthonia now belonged to Rogel Dawn. The immense banner bearing the Eye of Horus that had once hung high above the flanks of the ancient hive of Lupercal's Gate was torn down and burned. The city renamed as Traitor's Gate and ceded by order of the Emperor unto Dawn's control. Cthonia would be stripped of all its assets and treasures to fuel the ongoing war effort. What minerals and ores that could be extracted would be sent to Graia to power the forges of war, while the hardy people of Cthonia would serve either as brute labour, fodder for the thrall factories of the Lacrimata, or fill the ranks of the Imperial Fists as inductii. All sign and memory of the traitor Warmaster was to be removed and forgotten. His legion not just to be defeated on the field of battle, but those that would have been its future, suborned and remade as loyal warriors of the Emperor, as Imperial Fists. This monumental task fell to Lord Castellan Garius, that he not only hold Cthonia for his Primarch and Emperor, but also champion the imperial truth, remaking the native culture to serve the Imperium. Despite the title of Protector of Cthonia, few saw in this appointment anything other than yet another censure on Evander Garius's record, for his vainglory in battle had led to unnecessary casualties amongst the Housecarls and Varagir Terminators. Dawn had placed a heavy burden upon him, one last task to prove his worth to the Primarch, and a bitter punishment for his failures. For while bound to his new duty on Cthonia, Garrus would be unable to join the desperate war to safeguard the Imperium, and was forbidden from standing beside his master to face the coming storm. As Garius and his 456th Company took up their new posts with the stoic discipline expected of the 7th Legion, most of the other forces that had fought on Cthonia in the Emperor's name were reassigned to other war zones. With his need for warriors and material now critical, as Horus's legions pressed hard against the hurried defences Dawn had managed to assemble, garrison forces across the Segmentum Solar were stripped to provide soldiers, and the tithe demanded from those planets that remained loyal were increased. The risk of forcing more worlds into rebellion deemed acceptable in the face of Horus's onslaught. On Cthonia, where Garius now ruled from Horus's old throne, these new demands from Terra saw the loyalist forces on that world reduced to little more than a reinforced company of the Imperial Fists and several cohorts of light infantry from nearby Necromunda. This was barely enough to contain the Sons of Horus that lurked in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the surface of Cthonia, with their raids proving a constant threat and hindering the work of re-educating the proud people of Cthonia. These people would be forced up from the underworld to populate the half-functioning halls of Traitor's Gate and the vast slums at its feet, leaving the underworld as the haunt of rebels, criminals, and the Sons of Horus, a maze of tunnels where the Imperial Fists held no authority. To reinforce his dwindling garrison, Garius began rapid recruitment, conversion, and indoctrination of the most suitable of Chthonia's warlike inhabitants to constitute new inductii companies to bolster his defences and to supply Dawn with new troops for the Horus heresy. This process created a breed of space marines whose temperament was much different to that of the veterans of the Great Crusade. These were warriors raised and trained to fight other space marines, disposable weapons of war and nothing more, with no grounding in the tradition of the Legion or reverence for the Primarch that had ordered their creation. They wore the colours of the Imperial Fists with indifference, and Garius took care to keep them from the old traditions of their Chthonian forebears, lest they fall into the heresy that had overtaken the Sons of Horus. For it was only flash indoctrination that conditioned them to loyalty, not the years of war that had bound the original warriors of the 7th Legion to each other. Many of the inductii raised from Cthonia would be assigned to other Imperial Fist companies. This would slow Garius's attempts to build up the defences of Cthonia, but was countered to some degree by the benefices of fate. For Cthonia would receive some few unexpected windfalls from the battles fought across the wider Imperium. Several detachments of the so-called Shattered Legions, those of the legions that had suffered the worst casualties during the Dropsite Massacre, would seek to use Cthonia as a base for raids targeting traitor strongholds to the galactic south of Terra. They would even receive a detachment of 1,000 Sons, the remnants of the Fifth Fellowship, which had fled Prospero after its destruction and sought the mercy of the Emperor. They had at first been condemned to the prisons below the palace, but with the outbreak of the Horus heresy, had been offered a chance at redemption. Garius, who trusted these twice traitors as little as did his Primarch, quartered them in the Pharos Obscurus, the ancient Lumen tower that sat crumbling on the edge of the poisonous sea, and set them to fighting the remnants of the Sons of Horus garrison in the depths of the underworld. These would not be the last orphans of war to find their way to Cthonia, for as the tide of war shifted ever further in favour of the traitors, each new defeat would see more desperate souls bolstering Lord Castellan Garius's forces. When Talon fell, its surface now forever scarred by the fury of the traitor host, near 3 companies of Imperial Fists and Imperial Army troops would find their way clear and make the perilous journey to Cthonia, there to await the next assault with fatalistic stoicism. Less than a year later, Beta Garmon itself, the great fortress world Dawn had raised up to safeguard the borders of the Segmentum Solar, would fall before the Warmaster's onslaught, and the scattered loyalist forces would retreat back to new havens across the Segmentum and beyond. Each tragedy brought Garius and his warriors the tales of heroism and defiance that would form the bones of the Horus Heresy's legend, a legend that was written without them, trapped as they were in their duty to contain the traitors lurking in Chthonia's underworld. As the Horus Heresy turned towards its final chapter, and the Warmaster reached out his hand at last to Terra, Cthonia stood replete with warriors, gathered from last stands and massacres unnumbered, yet itself had barely felt the savage touch of battle. This monotonous doldrum was not to last, for in the last months of the Horus Heresy, war in all its terrible fury finally came to Cthonia to claim its due. Part 2. The beginning of the end. Good and evil are as the wind. They are fickle ideas whose value changes by the moment. Duty is like stone. It does not easily move, and its value weighs heavily upon those brave enough to accept it. Evander Garius, commander of the 456th Company of the Imperial Fists. 759013, Millennium 31. Few in those last terrible years of the Horus heresy expected an attack on Cthonia. Horus stood then at the apex of his might, having scattered the hosts of the Loyalists and broken the defences of Sol. His armies were now numberless hordes. His fleets reigned supreme, and his own power surpassed that of his brothers, and perhaps even that of the Emperor himself. He had no need for Cthonia, for to seize ultimate victory he had but to crush terror and tear the crown from his father's brow. The Warmaster had long since outgrown the lightless caverns of his youth. Yet many amongst the Sons of Horus beheld the Imperial Fists' occupation of their homeworld as an insult to the honour of their legion, seeing in Cthonia the image of the glory days of the Great Crusade. It was the constant symbol of the legion, unchanging even when the very heraldry of Horus's warriors changed, and to leave it in the hands of the enemy was to such warriors unthinkable. So, the assault on Cthonia was not motivated by strategic necessity, but by wounded pride and a desperate need to regain something the traitor legions had all but forgotten: honour. Even those of the legion that had never set foot upon Cthonia saw in it the epitome of the warrior, idolizing the brutal rites and bloody traditions of the gangs that once ruled the underworld, and imitating the manner of those that once walked in the darkness beneath that world. Many among the veteran warriors of the legion found these imitations to be poor copies, lacking the discipline and pride that had marked those who had fought through the trials of the Great Crusade. They bore the markings of the gangs of old and fought as fiercely, but where the gangs of old Cthonia had seen the blood and violence as a necessity of survival, the youngest warriors of the Sons of Horus relished it, not as the preferred tool of conquest, but as the purpose of their existence. This taint, the slow transformation from warriors to simple killers, progressed through the legion, even as their Primarch fell ever more under the influence of Lorgar and Erebus, a decline that some found reprehensible. The veterans who decried this dilution of the legion were as loyal to Horus and his rebellion against the Emperor as any, but sought to see that the legion remained the sharp blade it had once been, that the Warmaster had the tools needed to build his own empire. They were known within the legion by a simple title: the true Sons of Cthonia. Within the ranks of the Sons of Horus, the True Sons were a warrior society formed of those that followed the old laws of Cthonia and the traditions of the 16th Legion. Red-handed they were, and brutal in their manner, as had been demanded by the hardship of the Great Crusade. But they saw themselves as true warriors and men of honour, not as wanton butchers. They saw how the other traitor hosts of this period had been reduced to little more than ravening hordes of blood-mad berserkers and gleeful killers, by the influence of the fell powers of the warp and years of relentless slaughter, and the true Sons of Cthonia sought to stem that tide within the Sons of Horus. This came not from some effort to atone, for they remained as dedicated to the Warmaster as any of his followers, but the desire to maintain the purity of the Legion and its usefulness to the Primarch as a weapon in his war against the Emperor. The glorified Chthonian heritage of their legion became their weapon against the influence of Erebus and those that sought to debase the legions of old and render them something less than they had once been. Given their obsession with Cthonia and the traditions of those that fought and died in its lightless underworld, it is unsurprising that the True Sons found the loyalist occupation of that world particularly galling. Not only did it cut off the supply of proper Chthonian blood to the Legion, but it was also a stain upon the honour and pride of those that saw it as the true home of the Sons of Horus. They had long sought its recapture, but the True Sons had few advocates amongst the Warmaster's inner circle, which was increasingly dominated by the influence of outsiders, and only when the Warmaster stood on the threshold of victory would they be allowed to pursue this goal. The Precepts of Cthonia. The following is excerpted from one of the few remaining Chthonian texts that predates the arrival of the Emperor and the Imperium to that world. Such ancient texts were held as sacred by the True Sons, examples of the wisdom of Cthonia that they sought to emulate and promulgate throughout the Legion. This particular example is held to show that a true warrior must exercise both wit and violence in equal measure, ever striving to bring victory to the Legion until vanquished by a superior warrior and becoming a part of their legend. Some claim this is the origin of the Chthonian tradition of coating the skulls of honoured enemies in gold. Victory is a warrior's gold, bought by blood and cunning, its lustre undimmed by time, renewed in the red heart of battle, till in turn it is reaped anew, not in defeat, but in eternity. For gold is a warrior's tomb. The heart of the Legion. Foremost amongst the True Sons was the warrior Veren Ashurharden, renowned as the first of the Reavers, a son of Chthonia's Dark Gullet and a veteran of some of the most bloody battles of the Great Crusade. It was he that petitioned the Warmaster for the right to retake Cthonia, to offer it up to Horus as tribute when he sat upon the throne of Terra as the new master of mankind. With his forces ascendant in Sol and the surrounding systems, and only vague reports of the other legions sworn to the Emperor, Horus had little reason to deny the request of such a loyal warrior, knowing that many in his host would see the recapture of Cthonia as a potent symbol of his inevitable victory, even if its strategic value was insignificant. Veren was granted the Warmaster's seal and the authority to gather a fleet and expel the enemy from Cthonia, with few among the traitor host speaking against the attack. Indeed, it was only Alfarius that cautioned the Warmaster against the extravagance, urging him to devote his forces fully to the war in Terra. But the Warmaster chose not to heed the words of that unpredictable warlord. Veren wasted little time in assembling his forces, with his own veteran 23rd chapter of the Sons of Horus at the core of his fleet, and calling upon the other True Sons to lend their support to the assault. Led by Veren's own ship, the Tomb of Gold, the various commanders of the True Sons began to assemble in the ruins of the Beta Garman system, their ships laying at anchor near the Mandeville Point in preparation for the voyage through the Empyrean that would lead them to Cthonia. They would bear witness to the departure of Horus's own vast armada as it moved into the Sol System, believing his victory now to be inevitable, and measured their determination to retake Cthonia against their desire to stand at the Warmaster's side when he stood at the gates of the Imperial Palace itself. Yet pragmatism was one of the precepts the True Sons held dear, and so they satisfied themselves with the knowledge that their own battles would stand alongside those of their Primarch in the annals of history, once the new Imperium was built from the ashes of the old. In total, 6 chapters of the Sons of Horus would marshal for the attack, nearly 20,000 of the Legiones Astartes, all whom had been blooded and tested in the long years of the Horus heresy, a force that in the old days of the Great Crusade would have been enough to conquer entire star clusters, let alone a single world. Yet now they face space marines, and though the Warmaster's campaign to isolate Terra had driven many units away from Sol, it had also allowed others to rally to the relative safety of Cthonia, which now boasted a sizable garrison. Veren would claim command of a large contingent of those Imperial Army units now sworn to the Warmaster's service, including 4 full cohorts of the infamous Chthonian headhunters, as well as several units of armoured vehicles to serve as the core of his host, should he need to lay siege to the Imperial Fists' position. From the grim forge world of Voss, which had once held the right to explore the riches of Cthonia, came squadrons of blood-powered transport arks to join the invasion fleet. These cavernous ships carried the war machines of Voss and the titans of Legio Uricon, Andrastus and Magna, sent to assure that Voss would only reap the bounty of Cthonia and see its rivals, the Tech Magi of Graea, humbled and broken. Though these warriors cared little for the True Sons' more esoteric goals, they would prove vital to any attempt to retake Cthonia, for, as any Imperial commander well knew, the war titans fielded by the Graean Magi could only be defeated by other titans. The dour warriors of Voss and their automaton legions would not be the only outsiders to lend their aid to the True Sons' plans, for a contingent of word-bearer cruisers moved to join the gathering fleet at anchor, bearing warriors from the Flayed Hand chapter under Erebus's direct orders to join the attack and lend all aid to the conquest of Cthonia. Few among the True Sons had any respect for Lorgar's factotums, in whom they saw few of the warrior virtues the Chthonian credo espoused, and fewer still trusted that these emissaries of his were there purely to aid in the battle to come. However, Veren could ill afford to turn away any warriors that offered to fight at his side, and argued with his fellow captains that the word-bearers be allowed to prove their mettle and honour on the field of battle before they were condemned. It was, he told the gathered captains, the Chthonian way to judge a warrior by their actions and not their reputation, and should they be found lacking, then the battlefield would inflict its own punishment upon them. As a gesture of trust, Praetor Mordecai of the Flayed Hand was brought into the council of captains that ordered the invasion fleet, and showed a keen interest in the planning of the assault and the geography of Cthonia, most especially the configuration of the underworld tunnel that lay just beneath the surface of the planet. Last to arrive, even as the lords of the Legiones Astartes took final counsel aboard the Tomb of Gold, was the Alpha Legion scout cruiser, Sigma 914. It joined the vanguard of the fleet silently, without fanfare or even the customary hail to the fleet commander, taking up position alongside the other ships of the fleet and setting its transponder to match the True Sons' identification codes. The Alpha Legion warriors rebuffed all invitations to join the Council of Captains. Their commander, known only by the title Incursus, signalled their acceptance of the True Sons' strategic command of the operation and an intent to operate as an independent force. Well used to the secretive behaviour of Alpharius' sons, and unwilling to delay the departure of the fleet for a single ship, Vereen chose to simply accept the Alpha Legion warriors and, assuming they would follow no order but their own, made no plans that relied upon them. The invasion fleet was finally assembled. A vast armada of sleek cruisers, built for the traitors in the great forges of Cyclothrace and Zana II, as well as the blocky conveyor arcs and bombardment ships of the Mechanicum. With the final battle for Sol already underway, Veren and the True Sons had little time to press home their attack before their master, Horus, took final control of the Imperium. Veren had commanded many fleets before, ordered many assaults, yet now he stood on the brink of something truly momentous. A battle that might well decide the fate of his legion, his Primarch, and the Imperium itself. He spoke one word: begin, and reality was torn asunder as the fleet entered the warp. Broken hopes and failed glory. Following the auguries of their navigators and the occult foresight of Praetor Mordecai's word-bearer esoterists, the invasion fleet travelled unperturbed by the thrashing fury of the ruin storm. Now that Horus battled to control the very heart of the Imperium itself, the storm had become a frenzied maelstrom that stymied all attempts by the Loyalists to move at speed throughout the warp. But to Veren and his ships it posed no threat at all. In all, only 13 days would elapse between the fleet's departure from Beta Garmon and the arrival of its lead elements at Cthonia. for Varen had ordered all ships to move at best speed, rather than maintaining formation with the slower ships, a speed that has never been equalled in all of the years since. The price paid for this alacrity was in the fleet's cohesion. The first ship to emerge from the warp was Sigma 914, the Alpha Legion cruiser built around an exotic drive core of unknown provenance, which promptly ran afoul of the Loyalist outer patrols. The pair of Raven Guard light frigates, the Blade of Midnight and Shadow Eye, took the Alpha Legion craft for an opportunistic raider and turned immediately to attack, following standard orders issued by Lord Castellan Garius. For 4 frantic minutes, the Alpha Legion ship rolled and twisted through a series of evasive maneuvers impossible for any regular ship of the line. Torpedo feints and bursts of short-range EMP kept the Raven Guard craft at bay, until finally the advanced squadrons of the Sons of Horus burst through the veil of reality and into the Cthonia system. With the ancient heavy cruiser Tomb of Gold at the forefront, the Sons of Horus quickly put the Raven Guard to flight. The Shadow Eye turned at bay to hold back the traitor ships for a few moments, so that the Blade of Midnight could power out of their jamming range and broadcast a warning to the Imperial squadrons in orbit of Cthonia. Its duty done, the Blade of Midnight made a hard burn-out system, leaving the traitors to either divert their approach to Cthonia, to hunt it down, or abandon the chase. Varen had no intention of allowing the Raven Guard to distract him, for one damaged cruiser was no threat to his fleet. With more and more of his own squadrons translating into real space at the edge of the system, the traitors had come to Cthonia not to raid, but to conquer. Despite the strong garrison that waited on the surface of Cthonia, the forces gathered in orbit were nowhere near as intimidating, for the bulk of the Imperial fleets had been called back to Sol to resist Horus's main onslaught. Only 3 capital-class ships remained to defend Cthonia: the Imperial Fists Gloriana-class Burden of Duty, the immense Golgotha-class Grendel of the Iron Hands, and an ancient Fortuna-class trade bark, the Warpspite. Moreover, those titanic ships were supported by only 23 ships of the line and less than 100 destroyers and picket ships, while the traitor fleet boasted 5 huge capital ships, near 50 ships of the line, and well over 300 destroyers and corvettes. Forewarned by the Blade of Midnight's transmission, Garius knew full well that the Loyalist fleet was overmatched by its opponent, and he had little intention of wasting those ships without good cause. However, he could not cede Chthonia's orbit without a fight, and so the order was given. 100 suns were lit over Cthonia as the Imperial fleet went to war. Led by the Grendel, whose Iron Hands crew had vowed to give no more ground to the traitors that had slain their Primarch. Fully 2/3 of the Loyalist fleet left orbit to engage the enemy, while the remaining ships set course for the labyrinth of asteroids and broken rocks that lay at the heart of the Cthonia system. Attack and defense in one bold move, where some commanders might have seen only defeat, Garius sought to conjure victory. The Grendel and its escorts hit the advancing traitor craft like an avalanche, exploiting the traitors' lax formation to break through the foremost squadrons. The battle quickly dissolved into a point-blank melee of ships, all absorbed in separate duels with little sense of strategy, each ship fighting to stay alive. Here the traitors' advantage in numbers mattered little. Their ships spread out while the Loyalist craft were gathered like a bolt cast into the heart of the invasion fleet, the Grendel's innumerable gun batteries chewing apart one cruiser after another. The Mechanicum transport arcs was the Grendel's target. Garius had charged the Iron Hands with their destruction, knowing that the loss of their titans would be a critical blow to the traitor's strength. Shrugging off fire from a dozen traitor cruisers, lower decks aflame and hull riddled with boarding parties, the Grendel came within gun range of that objective. A fearsome barrage lit the void, something far greater than could be issued forth from the guns of a mere cruiser, a torrent of fire to smite the heavens themselves. but it did not come from the grendel. Instead, it pierced the side of the grendel with force enough to turn that metal behemoth from its course and split its meter-thick armor like paper. Mid-translation, the Sacra Astra, the black-hulled warship of the infamous tech magi Yelev Jakovac, had opened fire with a vast dark light lance. Heedless of the lesser traitor craft, it blasted apart in order to strike the grendel. On the heels of the Sacra Astra came the ships of Cyclothrace, their suicidal fury and exotic weapons enough to tip the balance decisively in the traitor's favour. The grendel was split wide open, and though its guns could still fire and pockets of its crew would fight on for another 3 hours, it was dead in space. A dozen or so loyalist cruisers punched a hole through the traitor formation and made for the safety of deep space. The remainder burned in the wake of the invasion fleet as it moved into orbit of Cthonia. Magos Dracovac offered his congratulations to Veren, offering his services in exchange for a portion of Chthonia's bounty, even as the Magi of Voss called for Veren to bar their rival from the campaign. However, Veren was faced with greater problems than the interminable politics of the tech magi of the Mechanicum, for as the grendel and the Imperial fleet had delayed him in the void, Lord Castellan Garius had prepared a welcome for him at Cthonia. The Pyre of Ambition. The invasion fleet controlled orbit, the loyalist ships either fleeing out-system or in hiding in the system's heart. But below them, the vast orbital plate that served as the link between the void above and the ground below was in ruins. Garius ordered that all power to the orbital plate be shut off, rendering it useless to the traitors and giving Veren due notice of his intentions. He would see Cthonia made worthless before he would give it up to the traitors. He would sacrifice every ship and every warrior he commanded to spite the foe. But he would do so only where their sacrifice would hurt his enemy. The orbital plate had been the primary means of transporting heavy cargo to Chthonia's surface via the orbital ladder that linked to the fortress known as Atlas. With the facility in ruins, Veren's only means of deploying his warriors was by orbital drop, straight into the teeth of the loyalist guns, straight into the heart of Garius's fury. End of Part 1 of the Siege of Cthonia.